Jimmy the Hammer Boyle was just a boy from Glasgow's East End when he learned that survival meant violence. By the time he was in his 20s, he had become the most feared enforcer in the UK, leaving a trail of betrayal, blood, and shattered rivals across Scotland and even the United States. This is the story of how a street kid rose to global infamy and why his name still makes gangsters tremble today. Please subscribe for daily new update of gang crime story and watch till end. Glasgow in the early 2000s was a city draped in fog and shadows, a place where danger lurked around every corner and trust was a rare currency. Jimmy the Hammer Boyle was born into this unforgiving world, in a cramped flat in the East End, where peeling wallpaper and the smell of damp cement were constant companions. His father, a small-time crook with a temper as quick as his fists, disappeared when Jimmy was only 10, leaving him to navigate the streets alone. His mother struggled to hold the family together, often working 2 jobs, leaving Jimmy to fend for himself. The streets became his school, and survival his only lesson. By the time he was 13, he had learned to read people, to spot danger before it arrived, and to assert control over every small corner of his world. Even at a young age, Jimmy's presence commanded attention. Other kids gave him space without a word, sensing something in him that set him apart. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, a kind of cold, sharp energy that hinted at a mind always calculating, always watching. Small gangs ran the neighborhood, and Jimmy quickly found a place among them, not as a leader, but as someone who could deliver messages, collect debts, and intimidate rivals. His work was precise, his timing flawless, and his ability to stay calm in tense situations became legendary in local circles. Every minor task he completed built his reputation, brick by brick, until whispers of the Hammer began circulating in corners of the city where his name was never spoken aloud in fear of attracting his attention. By 15, he was no longer just running errands. He began to observe the gang leaders, noting their strengths and weaknesses, learning the unwritten rules of loyalty, betrayal, and power. He watched the fights, the arrests, and the brutal enforcement of street codes, storing every lesson in the back of his mind. The more he observed, the more he understood that fear was as powerful as force, and that reputation could protect him even more than muscle. Jimmy began testing limits, confronting older kids, pushing boundaries, and surviving situations that would have broken others. Every challenge met, every obstacle overcome, only strengthened his resolve. The East End was a maze of narrow alleyways, abandoned warehouses, and dimly lit streets, and Jimmy knew it like the back of his hand. He used the environment to his advantage, learning secret paths, escape routes, and hidden spots where he could disappear in an instant. By 16, he had become a known figure in local gangs, someone whose approval was sought and whose wrath was feared. People started to whisper that Jimmy the Hammer Boyle was destined for more than petty street crimes, that he had a mind and a ruthlessness that could one day change the balance of power in Glasgow's underworld. And yet, behind the fear and the growing legend, Jimmy remained a boy shaped by loss and survival. The streets had taught him that life was fragile, that trust could be a trap, and that only those willing to take the hardest paths could ever rise above. The stage was set for what would come next, a first step into violence that would shock the city and mark the beginning of a terrifying ascent that no one could ignore. If you want, I can also expand Chapter 2 to 500 words, keeping the suspense and leading straight into Jimmy's first kill. That will make your story feel cinematic for YouTube viewers. Do you want me to do that next? By the time Jimmy Boyle turned 17, the streets of Glasgow had already molded him into someone others instinctively feared. His reputation as the Hammer was no longer whispered, it was spoken aloud, with a mixture of respect and dread. The city was alive with tension, rival gangs jockeying for territory, small-time hustlers trying to survive, and law enforcement always a step behind. Jimmy had learned the rules of the streets. Loyalty was fragile, betrayal could be fatal, and power was seized, not given. But no one could have predicted that his first act of true violence would leave an imprint on Glasgow's underworld that would echo for years. It began with a seemingly minor dispute between two small gangs over territory in the East End. Jimmy had been sent by his own crew to deliver a message, a warning to a rival faction that they were encroaching on territory that did not belong to them. The job seemed straightforward, almost routine. Jimmy approached it with the same precision he applied to everything else, studying the rival gangs' routines, watching their movements, and learning where they were weakest. The streets had trained him to see danger before it arrived, but nothing could fully prepare him for what would come next. The meeting was set in a narrow, dimly lit alley behind a shuttered warehouse. The rival gang members waited, unaware that Jimmy had something far more than a message in mind. The tension was palpable. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound amplified in the silence of the night. Jimmy knew that one wrong move could mean his death, but the city had already taught him that hesitation could be even more deadly. As he stepped into the alley, his heart beat steadily, his mind focused. He understood that the act he was about to commit would change everything, not just for the gang, but for himself. What began as intimidation quickly escalated into a brutal final act. A minor scuffle turned violent, and Jimmy reacted with precision and cold calculation. By the time the dust settled, one of the rival gang members lay dead, the alley soaked in the consequence of Jimmy's actions. The others fled, terrified, leaving Jimmy standing alone, the reality of what he had done settling over him like a dark cloud. It was his first kill, and though it shocked even him, it also cemented his reputation. The streets would remember this moment as the birth of a new power in Glasgow's criminal world. The aftermath of the killing rippled through the city. Rival gangs whispered his name with caution. His own crew looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear, and even those outside the criminal world sensed that something dangerous had emerged. Jimmy's first kill was not just a moment of violence, it was a statement. It proved that he could act decisively, that he could enforce fear without hesitation, and that he was willing to cross lines others would never dare approach. From that night on, his life would never be the same. The hammer had struck, and the streets of Glasgow would forever bear the mark of his rise. By the time Jimmy Boyle reached 20, he was no longer a young enforcer testing the limits of the streets. He had become a force to be reckoned with. His reputation as the Hammer was no longer confined to whispers and alleyways. It was known across Glasgow's underworld. Rival gangs kept their distance, wary of crossing someone who had already proven he could kill without hesitation. Jimmy had begun to climb the ranks of the Clyde Street Crew, one of the most feared gangs in the city, and with that rise came responsibility, power, and a new set of dangers. The streets were no longer just a battleground for survival. They were a chessboard, and Jimmy had become a master strategist. He studied his rivals carefully, learning their weaknesses, their loyalties, and their patterns. He orchestrated small operations that expanded the gang's territory, controlled drug trades, and strengthened their grip on protection rackets. Every move was calculated, every action precise, and every victory fueled his growing legend. But with power came envy. Not everyone within his crew was willing to follow, and not every rival was content to stay in the shadows. The twist came when one of Jimmy's closest allies, a man who had fought beside him through countless street battles, betrayed him. This trusted lieutenant tipped off a rival gang about Jimmy's operations, leading to a near-fatal ambush that could have ended his rise before it truly began. The streets were unforgiving, and betrayal was punished swiftly. Jimmy, however, was always thinking several steps ahead. Rather than reacting impulsively, he spent days tracking his betrayer, observing his routines, and planning an encounter that would send a clear message. The retaliation was ruthless. Jimmy orchestrated a trap that lured the betrayer and the rival gang into a deserted warehouse late at night. Every detail had been planned: the timing, the escape routes, the tools of intimidation. By the time the ambush was over, the rival gang was shattered, their power broken, and the traitor lying defeated. This event was more than vengeance. It was a declaration. Jimmy was no longer just a rising enforcer. He was a calculating, lethal force capable of reshaping the balance of power in Glasgow. The aftermath of the ambush sent shockwaves through the city. Other gangs began to fear even minor provocations, knowing that Jimmy could strike with precision and brutality. Within his own crew, loyalty intensified, but so did tension, as members realized that their lives depended on strict obedience. Jimmy's rise was fueled not just by fear, but by respect earned through ruthless efficiency. He was a young man who had learned that survival required both intelligence and savagery, and he wielded both with devastating effect. By the end of the bloody Clyde Wars, as the media would later dub the period of conflict, Jimmy had become a symbol of dominance in Glasgow's criminal world. Rival gangs had been dismantled, territories claimed, and the streets whispered of a new kingpin whose name alone could silence a room. Yet, even as he stood at the pinnacle of power, Jimmy knew the game was far from over. Betrayal, law enforcement, and rival ambitions were always just a heartbeat away. The next moves would be the most dangerous of his life, and the streets of Glasgow were ready to test him like never before. As Jimmy Boyle's influence grew, so did the attention of law enforcement. The streets of Glasgow had long been a chessboard of violence, but now the police were determined to put an end to his reign. Surveillance teams followed his movements, undercover officers infiltrated his crew, and every small operation was scrutinized. Jimmy, however, had learned early that survival in the underworld required constant vigilance. He changed locations frequently, rotated safe houses, and maintained a tight inner circle, loyal not only through fear, but through careful selection. Every new threat was a challenge to be calculated and controlled, and Jimmy approached it with the same cold precision that had built his reputation. It began with small signs: phones that seemed tapped, unusual faces lingering near his operations, and unexplained delays in shipments hinted that someone inside was providing information to the authorities. Jimmy noticed subtle changes in behavior among his crew: nervous glances, hushed conversations, and unusual hesitations that previously would have gone unnoticed. The betrayal was not yet visible, but the tension was tangible. He knew that one misstep could bring down everything he had built, and in the criminal world, mistakes were rarely forgiven. The breakthrough, or rather, the threat, came in the form of a young informant, a man desperate for money and eager to impress his handlers. He had managed to slip into the Clyde Street crew, gaining trust by performing small tasks and appearing loyal. For a time, he believed he was invisible, thinking that Jimmy would never suspect him. But Jimmy's instincts were honed to perfection. He could sense deception like a predator senses fear. Every action, every word, every hesitation was a clue, and soon the young informant's presence became undeniable. When Jimmy discovered the infiltration, his response was swift and brutal. He isolated the informant, studying him for a few tense days to understand what he knew and who else might be compromised. Then, in a move that shocked even hardened criminals, Jimmy executed a methodical strike that neutralized the threat without alerting law enforcement to his hand. The message was clear: betrayal would not be tolerated, and any who thought to undermine him would face consequences far worse than imprisonment. The city began to notice the changes. Police reports of mysterious disappearances and failed raids coincided with Jimmy's tightening control. Rival gangs hesitated, unsure whether the hammer was being watched or had simply become untouchable. Inside his crew, loyalty was absolute, but the constant vigilance created a tense atmosphere, a reminder that danger lurked not just outside, but within. Jimmy's intelligence, patience, and cruelty combined to create a network that was nearly impossible to penetrate, reinforcing his status as Glasgow's most feared enforcer. Even as law enforcement increased pressure, Jimmy remained several steps ahead. Every raid was anticipated, every potential informant monitored, and every rival carefully observed. The city had become a dangerous chessboard, and Jimmy was the master player, moving pieces with deadly precision. The tension of these days shaped him further, sharpening his instincts and preparing him for a stage far beyond Glasgow, where the stakes and the enemies would be even greater. Jimmy Boyle had survived the law, but the battle was far from over, and the underworld was ready to test him in ways he had never imagined. By his late 20s, Jimmy Boyle's empire had grown far beyond the narrow streets of Glasgow. He had established connections in London, Manchester, and even across the Atlantic in the United States. What began as local dominance had evolved into a sprawling network of criminal operations, moving drugs, weapons, and money through carefully constructed fronts that appeared legitimate to the outside world. Businesses in shipping, import-export, and even nightclubs masked the full scale of his operations. For Jimmy, expansion was not just about wealth, it was about power, reputation, and making sure his name carried weight wherever the underworld reached. The international expansion came with new dangers. American gangs, unaware of Jimmy's reputation, attempted to muscle into territories where he already had influence. They underestimated him, assuming that a Scottish enforcer would be confined to local operations. Jimmy watched quietly as they made their moves, analyzing every shipment, every route, every contact. He understood that a single mistake could cost him millions, or even his life. But Jimmy was nothing if not strategic. He planned a response that would be swift, decisive, and unforgettable, ensuring that anyone who dared challenge him would think twice. The opportunity came during a high-stakes meeting in Chicago, where American gang leaders had gathered to negotiate a new supply chain. Jimmy arrived not as a guest, but as a predator, blending into the crowd while his crew prepared for action. He had mapped every exit, memorized every security camera, and coordinated with trusted allies who had infiltrated the meeting under the guise of business partners. Every detail had been meticulously planned. There was no room for error. The tension in the room was electric, even before the first move was made, as Jimmy watched and waited, calculating the precise moment to strike. When the time came, the attack was devastating. Jimmy's operatives moved with surgical precision, taking control of the meeting and eliminating the American gang's top lieutenants in a display of brutal efficiency. There was no hesitation, no mercy. By the time law enforcement and other gang members arrived, the operation was over, leaving chaos, fear, and a clear message. Jimmy Boyle was no ordinary criminal, and his reach extended far beyond Glasgow. News of the strike traveled quickly through both the UK and US underworlds, and Jimmy's legend grew. Stories of his ruthless intelligence and strategic cruelty began to circulate like wildfire, cementing his reputation as a man who could strike anywhere, anytime, and emerge unscathed. The strike in Chicago was not only a victory, but also a warning. Jimmy had proven that geographical borders meant nothing to him. His influence was global, and anyone who underestimated him did so at their own peril. Allies and rivals alike adjusted their strategies, knowing that a single misstep could place them directly in his path. Even within his own crew, loyalty deepened, reinforced by fear and respect. Every operation, every plan, every calculated act of violence served to strengthen the empire Jimmy had built from the streets of Glasgow, turning him into one of the most formidable criminal figures the world had ever seen. Jimmy Boyle had become more than a local enforcer. He had become a symbol of power, control, and lethal strategy, feared not just for his fists, but for his mind. And yet, with every success came new enemies, larger stakes, and ever-increasing pressure. The international stage was vast, but the rules of survival remained the same. Trust no one, strike first, and leave a trail that assured no one would forget the name of Glasgow's most feared enforcer.
By the early 2010s, Jimmy Boyle's empire had reached its peak, stretching from the streets of Glasgow to the docks of Chicago, and the carefully constructed network he had built seemed untouchable. Yet even the most powerful empires have cracks, and Jimmy's was no exception. Years of constant vigilance, betrayal, and calculated violence had taken their toll. Rival gangs were still plotting, law enforcement pressure had intensified, and whispers of internal dissent began to surface within his own crew. For the first time, Jimmy felt the weight of the life he had chosen, a life built on fear, blood, and unyielding strategy, but one that offered no true sanctuary. The first sign of danger came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Shipments that were usually flawless arrived late. Safe houses showed signs of surveillance. Minor mistakes appeared in operations that Jimmy had personally overseen countless times. Someone was testing him, probing the empire he had fought so hard to construct. He could feel it in the tension of his crew, in the furtive glances of allies who had once followed his commands without question. The streets of Glasgow and the international underworld were watching, waiting for any hint of weakness. Jimmy knew that the next move could decide everything. One stormy night, a situation unfolded that would forever mark the end of an era. Jimmy's most trusted lieutenant came to him with urgent news. A rival faction had discovered the location of his primary safe house and was preparing a strike. In response, Jimmy executed a series of calculated maneuvers to mislead his enemies. Safe houses were abandoned, shipments rerouted, and false information planted, creating a web of deception designed to protect his movements. Despite the meticulous planning, the danger was palpable. For the first time, Jimmy faced a threat that even he could not completely control. A reminder that the streets and the world always had their own rules. Then, in a shocking and dramatic twist, Jimmy vanished. One night, the safe house was empty. His wealth remained, his crew waited in confusion, and the underworld buzzed with speculation. Some believed he had been killed by a hidden rival, his body never to be found. Others whispered that he had fled abroad, possibly to South America, using hidden escape routes he had built over the years. Law enforcement had no leads, gangs scrambled to fill the power vacuum, and the city was left with only stories of the enforcer who had once controlled every corner of Glasgow. Even in disappearance, Jimmy Boyle's legend endured. The streets remembered the strikes, the ambushes, the strategic brilliance, and the merciless precision that had made him a figure feared across continents. Stories of his ruthless rise were told in hushed tones in pubs, alleys, and warehouses. His empire may have fractured, but the imprint he left on Glasgow and the international criminal world was permanent. Jimmy had transcended mere criminality. He had become a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a myth in the making. Whether dead or alive, Jimmy Boyle's name continued to carry power. He was remembered not just for his violence, but for his intellect, strategy, and the unwavering determination that had transformed a boy from Glasgow's East End into a global enforcer. His disappearance marked the end of a reign, but it also immortalized him. The hammer had struck, and though the streets were free of his immediate presence, no one ever forgot the terror and legend of Glasgow's most feared enforcer.